Chapter 3, Anne's History. Anne sat up in bed. She didn't know where she was. Then she remembered. This was Green Gables, and they didn't want her because she wasn't a boy. Anne jumped out of bed and knelt in front of the window to look out. On both sides of the house were apple and cherry trees. In the garden stood lilac trees with purple flowers. Beyond the garden, a field sloped down to a brook, and past that was a hill covered with spruce and fir trees. Anne was startled by a hand on her shoulder. "It's time you were dressed," Marilla said. Anne stood up. "Green Gables is so beautiful," she said. "I was imagining that I was going to stay here forever and ever." "You'd better get dressed. Never mind your imagining," said Marilla. "Breakfast is waiting." Soon Anne was downstairs. Her clothes were neat, her hair was brushed and braided, and her face was washed. After breakfast, Anne offered to clean the dishes. "Can you wash dishes right?" Marilla asked. "Pretty well," Anne said, "but I'm better at looking after children. It's too bad you don't have any here for me to look after." "I don't want any more children than I've got now," said Marilla. "You're a problem enough. What's to be done with you? I don't know. Matthew is a silly man." "I think he's lovely," Anne said. "I felt he was a kindred spirit as soon as I saw him." You're both odd, if that's what you mean," Marilla said with a sniff. You may wash the dishes, use plenty of hot water, and be sure to dry them well." After Anne washed the dishes, Marilla told her she could go outside until lunch. Anne ran to the door, but when she reached the doorway she stopped. She turned and came back to the table. "What's the matter now?" demanded Marilla. "I don't dare go out," Anne said. "I won't be able to help loving all those trees and flowers and the orchard and the brook. It's so hard to keep from loving things, isn't it?" "I was very glad when I thought I was going to live here. I thought I'd have so many things to love, but that dream is over, so I don't think I'll go out. I'll just sit here." Anne sat at the table until Matthew came in for lunch. As they ate, Marilla said, "I'm going to drive to White Sands with Anne. Mrs. Spencer will probably arrange to send her back to the orphanage." Matthew said nothing. After lunch, he hitched the horse to the buggy. Then he opened the yard gate for Marilla and Anne. Marilla looked back as the buggy bounced along. Matthew was leaning over the gate, looking sadly after them. "I've made up my mind to enjoy this drive," Anne said. "I'm not going to think about the orphanage. Are we going to the Lake of Shining Waters today?" "We're not going over Barry's Pond, if that's what you mean," Marilla said. "And if you're going to talk, you might as well tell me about yourself." "I was 11 last March," Anne started. "I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My parents were Walter and Bertha Shirley. They were teachers. They both died of a fever when I was a baby." "No one knew what to do with me," Anne continued. "I didn't have any relatives. Finally, Mrs. Thomas said she'd take me. She was our housekeeper. I helped look after her 4 children, and they took a lot of looking after. When I was 8 years old, Mr. Thomas died. His mother wanted Mrs. Thomas and the children, but she didn't want me." "Then what happened?" Marilla asked. "Then Mrs. Hammond took me because I was handy with children," Anne said. "She had 8 children. 6 of them were twins. Then Mr. Hammond died. Mrs. Hammond and her children left, so I had to go to the orphanage. It was overcrowded, but they had to take me." "Were those women good to you?" Marilla asked. Anne's face turned red. She looked embarrassed. "Oh, they meant to be," she said slowly, "but they had a lot to worry about, you know. They were poor, and Mrs. Thomas's husband was a drunk a lot of the time." Marilla asked no more questions. Pity was stirring in her heart for Anne. What a terrible life she had. No wonder she longed for a real home. What if she let Anne stay at Green Gables? Matthew was set on it, and Anne seemed nice enough.